Hello, Dr. Colbert. My name is Caitlin McMary, and today I will be presenting on racism, nativism, and immigration policy. This is chapter 13 of the book that we learned from this semester. So the agenda today, I'm going to be talking about the timeline of immigration policy, and I'm also going to be focused on some of the policies, not all of them, but some of the policies that went into effect in the United States, and also what is going on today. And also the different types of immigrations as well. So the immigration policy, so it started in 1730 with the Naturalization Law, and then in 1731 we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then in 1924 we have the Immigration Act, the Oriental Exclusion Act, the creation of Border Patrol, and then in 1942 to 1964 we have the Bracero Program, and then in 1950 to 1954 we have the Operation Wetback. In 1965, we have the Immigration and Nationality Act. In 1986, we have Immigration Reform and the Control Act. And then in 1996, we have Anti-Terrorism and an Effective Death Penalty, Illegal Immigration Reform, and the Immigration Responsibility Act. Then we have the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. And then in 2012, we have the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So, racialized history of the U.S. and immigration policy. So, reflection of the societal racism and nativism was in the immigration policy. The nativism favors the allocation of resources to native-born citizens over immigrants. It promotes a fear of foreign culture. And then the racist nativism is a prominent feature of contemporary American society. The fear of foreigners is rationalized, and natives' sentiments are directed at particular racial groups such as Mexicans and people from the Middle East. So some of the policies that we are going to be talking about that went into place is the Oriental Exclusion Act, which expanded the Chinese Exclusion Act and prohibited from immigration from Asia to the United States. And then Bracero Program is a U.S. government program that brought in temporary workers from Mexico between 1942 and 1964. And then Operation Wetback was the massive roundups of Mexicans by the U.S. Border Patrol from 1950 to 1954. And then we also have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which was legislation that put an end to the racially biased quotas set forth in the 1924 Oriental Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1924. And it set a universal quota of 20,000 immigrants of every country in the world. And then we have a legal permanent resident, which is a foreign national who is granted the right to remain in the United States and who will be eligible for naturalization after a period of 3 to 5 years. And then the McCarran Internal Security Act, which was a 1950 U.S. law designed to combat communism. It required members of the Communist Party in the United States to register with the federal government, and it allowed for the deportation of foreign nationals who were members of the Communist Party. So types of racialized immigration, so we're going to be focusing on 4, which is the Chinese immigration, Indian immigration, Korean immigration, and Vietnamese immigration. And so the way that the United States tried to combat illegal immigration was through the Illegal Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. It was a series of immigration provisions that offered a legalized option for undocumented workers living in the United States and imposed sanctions on employers who hired undocumented workers. So Chinese immigration, the contractors, so the history of it was the contractors bought 10,000 plus Chinese migrants from construction to construct on the railroads, and it peaked in 1807 when Chinese immigrants became legal residents in the United States. And then immigration decreased because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. White people basically felt threatened, and they started to fear that Chinese people were taking their jobs, and so there was a decline in Chinese immigration because of the act. And then following the 1943 repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, Chinese immigration began to increase, and in the 1980s, 171,000 Chinese immigrated to the United States and continued to increase. Filipino migration. The Philippines was a U.S. colony from 1898 until 1946, and around 113,000 migrated to Hawaii and worked at sugar plants. And as the number of Filipinos began to increase in the 1990s, whites increasingly began to see Filipinos as a problem and a threat, just like the Chinese immigrants. They feared that they were taking their jobs. And then Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which limited Filipino immigration to an annual quote to 50. And between 1965 and 1985, about 667,000 Filipinos obtained visas from the United States. And then Vietnamese migration. So the first wave of refugees came between 1971 and 1980, and it had 150,000 Vietnamese that were admitted to the United States. The reunification provisions of the 1965 Act led to the growth of the Vietnamese population. And in 2000, census reported that the presence of over 1 million Vietnamese are in the United States, and that number is obviously bigger today. So Korean immigration, it was similar to Indian patterns. Over 7,000 Koreans migrated to Hawaii to work on sugar plantations between 1903 and 1905. And with the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, Koreans became the largest immigrant group in the United States. And then Indian immigration. So it sent a large number of immigrants to the United States before the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act. And between 1966 and 1981, 215,640 Asian Indians came to the United States. And in 2015, Indians was the third largest sending country for legal permanent residents, as 64,116 Indians became legal permanent residents that year. So immigration policies and nativism in the 21st century. So the United States began to witness a surge in nativism not seen in the 1920s. And so immigration policy and nativism in the 21st century, there's three factors that distinguish contemporary racialized nativism from a century ago. So the first one was the rise of extreme antipathy towards the language other than English. And then the concern that Asian, Caribbean, and Latin American immigrants are taking advantage of affirmative action programs designed to help native-born minorities, especially African Americans. And the last one is that the worry that immigrants are draining public resources through the use of welfare, education, and healthcare services. And then Donald Trump's presidency also. His presidency played into the fear of nativist and racial language. And then he also ran his campaign on anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim platforms. He also tapped into the discord of hatred towards immigrants and Muslims. His rally cry was to build the wall, and he played his racial fears related to economic and demographic changes in the United States. And then he also placed the Muslim ban, which was an executive order called Protecting the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States, and he banned entry from 7 Muslim countries, which were Iraq, Syria, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. Now that we are in the President Biden administration, he's working hard to reverse a lot of the Trump era administration things concerning immigration. And so also because of the pandemic, there was a halt on how many people can come into the United States. So there was a very vast decline in people who receive visas and people who receive green cards in the United States concerning immigration. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Colbert, for listening and looking at my presentation. Have a happy holiday, and I enjoyed this course very much.